weeks, yeah.
Well,
So I'll be back,
you won't be speaking.
So, huh?
He's not gonna speak for police, I think.
No.
I'm gonna check, I'll be a check.
Right.
I'll be
Rabbi, are you going to America this year?
No.
Oh, okay. Once we traveled together many years ago. Okay. Hashem has a daughter here as well.
Okay, it's all set up for a change, ready to go.
Have a wonderful piece.
Thank you. It'll be different. It's the first time I've left Israel for Pesach in 10 years.
Oh, good. That's very special.
No, it's not sure it's fail. It's different.
I know somebody who's going to the Sinai
Yeah.
and to Egypt. I said, well, didn't we leave there?
Can you imagine?
A couple thousand years ago.
I know that I think go to Egypt and Pesach.
Yeah, I don't get the sale in it, but you know, whatever. Everyone does their own thing.
Yeah, there's a lady in the post today, she's a lawyer, Natanya. I'm wearing pants. She writes a story that says, I don't know anything about halakha, I don't know anything about religion, but I've decided I'm wearing pants. This is her story, so she writes the story.
I tell you what, people only write articles about.
Is what?
No, I'm just saying, man, it's amazing.
Amazing what they print.
That's right.
No, I suppose there's two ways to look at it.
What's new? What's your Pesach? What's your Pesach? We're going to see your parents. We're going to your parents. We're going to go to France? We're going to France. We're visiting with your parents. Yeah, you might see a rocket or two. You might see a rocket or two over there. 2 weeks, we're there, 12, back in the 20s. Huh? Leaving on the 12th, coming back on the 27th. Right now, you don't have to need test to go out. They come back, they just, they go to the airport, they do the test, they come back here. When you come back, they pay for advance, $90. You're supposed to raise $4 price, $5. Or $6, and yet, if you have to give you the result of 20. Was that over there? Okay. Will? Could you bring my bottle? Should be a lot easier than last time. September, we might go to a city to get the test, we can come back, and then you never go. Test comes back in time, you know, so a big convenience, not to take the test. They always want to bring lots of it? No, we're not being a community, we're gonna be at a community center. And then. It's right here, no, the parents are 3 hours away. Huh? The parents are 3 hours away. Oh, 3 hours away car. You stay there, or you walk. What? You walk back and forth. Staying at somebody's house there. Show, and then for home over to the parents. In Vienna, they're supposed to. This is a good, like a super show, it's gotta be what you want. It's supposed to be over there. So it's, well. Yeah. Once we're overseas, there's no halacha. I mean, it's, you're supposed to try to eat nuts. But you don't actually have to eat nuts, except for safe. Right. What? Last week you weren't here, I sent it to you. Last week you weren't here, I sent it to you. I sent it. 3 weeks. It's raining. Yeah, it's raining. It's snowing.
Like the room, but it's still,
It's cool here, but you just- Yeah, both of them. He and I both grew up in Chicago. Just 20 years. Any grandchildren? Any grandchildren yet? Oh, I don't know. Your daughter's got quite a handful. Your poor daughter has quite a handful. It's always tough. You see what? I spoke to him before. I spoke to him before. I spoke to him on the phone because he doesn't want. Even on the phone. You know you are. It's getting to be very close. It's getting worse. But it's always a mitzvah to go visit. It's always a mitzvah to go visit and the others. You're the son of the Lord. Son is here. There's a son is here in big church. Daughter. Okay, Rabbi Wein.
We've got another minute, another 2 minutes. Yeah. That's what the clock says.
The phone says it's, the phone is a little bit more accurate than the clock.
You can go according to that.
Oh, okay.
You go according to the halacha here.
Oh, right, they didn't change the clock for the daylight savings thing.
Boker Tov, everyone.
Okay,
As we are all aware, this Shabbat is Parsha Chodesh. It's the first mitzvah that the Jewish people were commanded in Mitzrayim. Parshat Bo, Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, Rosh Chodoshim L'Chodshei Hashon. So our calendar goes from Nisan to Nisan. And Nisan is the first month. Nevertheless, the annual calendar goes from Tishrei to Tishrei. This is a discussion in the Gemara, whether the world was created in Nisan or created in Tishrei. So this is like a compromise position between the two opinions. The Rosh Hashanah for the calendar months is Nisan, and the Rosh Hashanah for the year is Tishrei. And so I'd like to discuss some of the niceties of the Jewish calendar and some historical events that occurred regarding the calendar, because we take it just for granted. The calendar is printed and sent out, and that's the calendar. And Gabbai announces when Rosh Chodesh will be, and he announces when the Molad will be. So how does it work? What does it mean, HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem? So Rashi already points out, based on the Gemara, that Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the secrets of the calendar. Why does the calendar need secrets? Why isn't it straightforward? There are two ways to have a calendar. One is to have a solar calendar, which is 365 and a quarter days approximately. And so that's a straight calendar, which is basically the secular calendar which exists. So this is April 1st. And then there is a lunar calendar, which is based on the phases of the moon. And the moon waxes and wanes every 29 and a half days approximately. So that's a lunar calendar. The Muslim world follows a lunar calendar. That's why Ramadan starts now. The Jewish calendar is both a solar and a lunar calendar. It's a rare thing. And in halacha, it exists, Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. Now, in the time of the Beit HaMikdash and the time of the Sanhedrin, so even for a few hundred years after the Churban Bayis Sheni, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the day of Rosh Chodesh was decided not by mathematical calculation, but it was decided by witnesses who came and said they saw the sliver of the moon. And they came and testified in Bet Din, in the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin then declared what day was Rosh Chodesh. The Sanhedrin had flexibility. In other words, the calendar was not meant to be 100% rigid. And if there were circumstances that somehow would justify moving ahead or moving behind a day, so then the Sanhedrin had the latitude to do that. So for instance, they never wanted to have that Rosh Hashanah should begin, the first day should begin on Sunday. Because then you wouldn't be able to have burials. The Shabbos was before. So they could adjust. So even though the calculation would be that Aleph Tishrei should be on a Sunday, they would make Aleph Tishrei on a Monday. So there always was that flexibility. And that's what it means, HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem. God said, I give it to you. You can play with it. It doesn't have to be rigid. When the Sanhedrin no longer existed, in about the 4th century of the Common Era, for various reasons, it no longer could maintain itself. So then the Sanhedrin itself established a permanent calendar. By that, we mean a calendar that could be determined by mathematical calculation. And that this would be, so to speak, an eternal calendar. You could always figure it out. And it would go from generation to generation. That's a remarkable feat. We're talking about, you're not talking about an age of computers or slide rules or telescopes or great advances in astronomy. So it had in it the divine spark of creativity, of heaven, so to speak, lending a hand in the establishment of the calendar, because it has to work. The calendar is the basic thing in Jewish life. When the communists took over in Russia, they banned the Jewish calendar, because they knew that as long as it was a Jewish calendar, and Jews would know when Yom Tov was, when Hanukkah was, etc., etc. The spark of Judaism could never be extinguished. So they banned the calendar. Sharansky has in his book, Mendelovich also, that when they were in the Gulag, they tried to figure out when Hanukkah would be. And there was no calendar. They knew it would be sometime in December, but sometimes Hanukkah is the beginning of December, sometimes it's the end of December. So they said that they started saving slivers of soap fat that would serve as the fuel, and they tore threads from their prison uniform to be the wicks, and they decided what day Hanukkah would be. And he says later they found out that it wasn't on that day. But nevertheless, they said, we lit Hanukkah candles in the Gulag. It was Mahadrin min Mahadrin. It was the best possible. So the calendar was it's the basic foundation of Jewish life. Everything in Jewish life is according to the rhythm of the calendar. So the rabbis established a permanent calendar, which is both a lunar and a solar calendar at one and the same time. Why does it have to be a solar calendar? Why can it not be just a lunar calendar the way the Muslims have it? Because in the Torah it says, Atem yotzim b'chodesh Aviv. Pesach has to always be Chodesh Aviv, the month of springtime. So Pesach pretty much has to be the end of March to the end of April. That's the window. If you have a lunar calendar, then Pesach will go around the year the way it does in the Muslim calendar, Ramadan, because the lunar calendar is 354 days a year, and the solar calendar is 365 and a quarter days. So there's 11 and a quarter days difference. After 3 years, there's a month difference. After 6 years, it'd be 2 months. So that Pesach would end up in December, it would end up in August. It would be all year round. And yet we are limited that Pesach has to be b'chodesh Aviv. It has to be in the month of springtime. So therefore we have to correct the lunar calendar to adjust it to the solar calendar. That correction is what gives us what we call a Shnat Ibur, a leap year, which in the Jewish calendar will now have 13 months instead of 12 months. So that'll push Pesach later, and then it will recede over the next few years, and then we'll do it again. But it will always be b'chodesh Aviv. It will always be in the spring month. Now, every 19 years, again, the astronomy here is absolutely unbelievable. There's a whole section in the Chazon Ish on the calculations. This is a time when they didn't have trigonometry and calculus to figure it. And they didn't have that little machine that you just hit the button and you're a genius. So the leap year is based on the fact that every 19 years there is the exact same alignment of the planets as it was at the beginning of time. In other words, the moon and the sun and the planets in their orbits every 19 years come back to the same place relative to each other. It's one of the great phenomena of astronomy. So the rabbi said, and let's look at the 19-year cycle. It's called the Machzor cycle, back and forth. And they said, in this 19-year cycle, in order to even out the solar calendar with the lunar calendar, we will make 7 of the 19 years leap years. So we will add a month. We add 7 months in the 19-year cycle, and you'll multiply it out, that's 200 days, and then it'll be pretty even. But it's not exact. It's not nearly exact. So then the rabbis adjusted it further. And they said there are certain months that will be 29 days and certain months will be 30 days. Because the moon, the month of the moon is 29 and a half days. You can't have 29 and a half. So that what we do is we alternate. 1 month is 29 and 1 month is 30. That's why we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh when it's a 30-day at the end of the month, and 1 day Rosh Chodesh when it's a 29. So we will adjust the months of Cheshvan and Kislev. Some years they will both be 29. Some years they will both be 30. Some years one will be 29 and one will be 30. So that gives us a flexibility again, so that we can be as near to accuracy as possible. even that is not true as far as accuracy is concerned, because we're always off a little. But because of the fact that HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, it was given over to you, so even if you fudge it a little, it still is what you say it is. So if you say that Pesach is then now, so if Pesach is now, somebody will come with great math calculations and say it should be a day later or a day earlier. We will ignore that person because it's given over to us to decide what day it is and how the calendar should work. So through mathematical calculations, I'm not going to go through it now, especially that we orally, it would be very difficult. But you'll take the over 200 extra days that the leap years give us and add it to the days of the, so it's 19 years plus 210 days, whatever, plus whatever you fudged with Kislev and Cheshvan, and then you'll multiply 365 and a quarter days by 19, you come out to practically the same number, and that's how we balance it. Now, because of the fact that 365 and a quarter is also not exact, it's not 6 hours, it's only 5 hours, 55 minutes and something. So by the 16th century, the non-Jewish calendar, the secular calendar, was off quite a bit. And that was called, that calendar was from the Roman Emperor Justinian. It's called the Justinian calendar. And the Pope Gregory, so he's going to fix the calendar, make it more accurate. And so they, like 11 days disappeared from the calendar. And they started again. And that's the Gregorian calendar we have today, which also has, it has a leap day every 4 years, except on a millennial year. And that also is meant to balance the calendar with the movements of the sun, because it's a purely solar calendar. So from the 4th century till about the 15th, till about the 9th, 10th century, for 500 years, the Jewish calendar was established based on these calculations, and nobody raised any problems with it. However, in the 9th century, so Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon was the Gaon in Bovel. Gaon then was not the description, it was a title. The Gaon was the leading rabbinic figure recognized by the caliph, recognized by the government. He had powers from the Jewish community. It was a position not only of honor, but of actual strength and power. There was a Rav in Yerushalayim. Here's the example of the rule that I always say, that there's always another rabbi. There was a Rav in Yerushalayim, Ben Meir was his name, who was a great scholar, and he was the Rav in Yerushalayim. Now, there always was a turf war, so to speak, between the scholars in Israel and the scholars in Bovel. Which one, so to speak, should have the upper hand? The scholars in Israel said that we're certainly entitled because we live in Eretz Israel and Eretz Israel is dominant. The scholars in Bavel said that most of the Jews are living in Bavel and under our influence. And Eretz Israel is supported by the Jews of Bavel financially. So we are the ones that are the decisors of Jewish law. You have to, if you'll think about it, you'll see that things don't change much. Right? The rabbis in England or America, are they bound by the decisions of the rabbinate here in Israel? You see that they're not. They run their own ship. So Ben Meir, who is the Rav in Yerushalayim, says that he recalculated all of the calendars and that the calendar is wrong. It's off. It's off a day. In other words, the 15th of Nisan, which is Pesach, should not be on Monday, it should be on Tuesday. And he published his findings and he sent them out throughout the Jewish world. Well, you can imagine the stir that it caused, because that means if Pesach is on a different day, so then the Jews will be eating, God forbid, chametz on the day that it's Pesach. And the whole thing will be in question. So he sent out this missive. And the Jewish world split. And Rabbeinu Sadia took up the cudgel against Ben Meir. And he wrote the long treatise to prove that Ben Meir's calculations were incorrect and that the traditional calendar of the Jewish people was the correct one and that no other calendar should be followed. Now, Rabbeinu Sadia was a great polemicist. No one ever bested him in arguments. And he was this great imposing rabbinic figure. But this dispute lasted for almost a decade. So can you imagine that, like, for 10 years, they're arguing when it's Pesach? Imagine what that would do to the hotels. When is Pesach? And then it's when is Rosh Hashanah? And when is Sukkot? Because all of you're changing the days of the calendar. But after about a decade, the power of Rabbeinu Sadia was such that the dispute waned. The followers of Ben Meir slowly gave up the fight and agreed with Rabbeinu Sadia. And that established really the supremacy of the Gaonim of Bovel over everyone else in the Jewish world regarding matters of halacha and of policy. And that became the calendar, which is the one that we have today. Now, according to the Jewish calendar, the hour is divided, the day is divided into 24 hours, and every hour is divided into 60 seconds. Every second is divided into 360 chalokim, So it's a sixth of a second. It's a sixth of a second, the chelik. It's very hard to measure, but they do measure. Today, we do have instruments to measure that. And you see it many times in sports events that the guy won by a 10th or a 20th of a second. So we could, this sixth of a second was a chelik. And therefore, when we announce when the moled is, when the new moon, we calculate when the new moon is born. So we say it's this and this day or night, it's so many hours, so many minutes, so many chalokim. Now, to further confuse the issue, there is something that's called the true molad and the molad that we follow. The true molad, based upon more accurate calculations, is different than the molad which is announced in shul. Sometimes even significantly different. And so that becomes a matter in halakha, whether we ignore it or don't ignore it, or whether we should adjust to it or not adjust to it. So as I mentioned, the Achronim, the Chazon Ish discussed it, Rav Shlomo Zalman discussed it, Rav Moshe Feinstein discussed it. It's an ongoing discussion till today as to the accuracy, whether we should adjust to to, so to speak, the realistic accuracy, or do we rely upon the fact that we said that this is when it is, so that's when it is. Because it was given over to us to be able to do it. In our time, again, though it was, it's a very ancient question, it was already a question in the Middle Ages and earlier. Where is the international date line? When does the day end? Where do I say that Tuesday becomes Wednesday? So there were great differences of opinion, and there are differences of opinion until today. Basically, there are three main opinions. One opinion, Rav Kasher and others who dealt with it extensively, said that whatever the non-Jewish world, the scientific world, so to speak, says is the international dateline, we accept that to be international dateline. So even though it's not a straight line, it goes in and out to include certain islands and exclude certain islands. It's basically in the Pacific Ocean. So Japan and Korea are on the other side of it, China and California and Hawaii are on this side of it. That's one opinion. The second opinion was Rav Herzog, who spent a great deal of time researching it. And he drew the international dateline much closer to the American shore. So the question arose about Hawaii. According to Rav Herzog, Hawaii is already tomorrow. So if you go to Hawaii for a vacation or for the Seder, it's lo pashut, it's not simple. Because according to one opinion, Hawaii is going to be Saturday, and according to the other opinion, it's going to be Sunday. And therefore, many religious Jews avoid going for weekends to Hawaii because of the fact that it's a halachic question. Then there's the third opinion, which is the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was asked, the Mir Yeshiva in the Second World War somehow saved themselves. They went to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union sent them to Japan. Japan was going to send them to Curacao. They had visas to go to Curacao. The whole story with the Japanese consul and covenant, etc. But a few thousand Jews were saved. So they ended up in Kobe, Japan. The Japanese put them in Kobe because there was a small Sephardic Jewish community in Kobe all the years, and they were in the pearl business. Came time for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So they sent a telegram to the Chazon Ish. When is Yom Kippur in Kobe? It's a good question. Because that's the question, where is Japan relative to the international date line? So the Chazon Ish's shita, I'm oversimplifying it, but his opinion was that anything that's attached to the European mainland is like Europe. So for instance, Korea, which is attached, so it's the same day like in London or in Paris. But anything that's not attached, like Japan or Taiwan, that's not attached to the mainland, is the other side of the international date line. So he sent them a telegram that said, eat on Tuesday, fast on Wednesday, which is what they did. But I would say that the majority of halachic opinion today is not like the Chazon Ish. It's more like Rav Herzog. But again, you have this problem, and it's already raised by the Meiri in the 14th century. Where's the international date line? When does the day change? So these are not merely theoretical issues. These are practical issues of halacha. I know many Jewish businessmen that do business in Japan and the Orient. So they don't stay in Japan for Shabbos, because it's a question when Shabbos is, and they fly to Korea, to Seoul, because it's attached to the European mainland, and they follow that shita. So all of this is in play today, and all of this is involved because HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem. It's all given over to you, and how the halacha will decide it. That is the way the calendar exists, the date line exists, the holidays exist according to those rules. So have a good Chodesh and a good Pesach, and Kol Tuv Shalom, Shabbat Shalom.
Christians calculate Easter?
I didn't hear you.
How do Christians calculate Easter? It always seems to fall out when Jesus is.
I happen to know, if you want to know, the Pope, about 500, decided to make Easter the first Sunday
Right,
after the first after the first full moon, after the spring equinox.
that's right.
So it always turns out to be close to Easter
Right. It
because,
goes to Pesach because it's always after our Chodesh.
Calculate with the Jews or-
no, they did it specifically, Mamish, to say that they weren't doing it on Easter, on Pesach. They made their own calculation, but it's nonsense because it comes out on Easter every time. But
Yeah.
when we have an extra month, it doesn't. This year it does, even with the extra month, it does. Right, this month it does.
I couldn't figure out how to make this folk side.